The Misanthrope by J.D.Beresford and read by Christopher Halton. Since I have returned from the rock and discussed the story in all its bearings, I have begun to wonder if the man made a fool of me. In the deeps of my consciousness I feel that he did not. Nevertheless, I cannot resist the effect of all the laughter that has been evoked by my narrative. Here on the mainland, the whole thing seems unlikely, grotesque, foolish. On the rock, the man's confession carried absolute conviction. The setting is everything, and I am perhaps thankful that my present circumstances are so beautifully conducive to sanity. No one appreciates the mystery of life more than I do, but when the mystery involves such a doubt of oneself, I find it pleasanter to forget. Naturally, I do not want to believe the story. If I did, I should know myself to be some kind of human horror, and the terror of it all lies in the fact that I may never know precisely what kind. Before I went, we had eliminated the facile and banal explanation that the man was mad, and had fallen back upon the two inevitable alternatives, crime and disappointed love. We were human and romantic, and we tried desperately hard not to be too obvious. Once before, a man had made the same attempt and had built or tried to build a house on the Gullen Rock, but he had been defeated within a fortnight, and what was left of his building was taken off the island and turned into a tin church. It is there still. We all went to Trevone and ruminated over and round it, perhaps with some faint hope that one of us might, all unknowing, have the abilities of a psychometrist. Nothing came of that visit but a slight intensification of those theories that were already becoming a little stale. We compared the early failure of 30 years ago, the attempt that was baffled, with the present success. For this new misanthrope had lived on the Golan through the whole winter, and still lived. Indeed, the fact of his presence on that awful lump of rock was now accepted by the country people. To them he was scarcely a shade madder than the other visitors. That remunerative recurrent host that this year broke their journey to Bedruthen in order to stand on Trevone beach and stare foolishly at the just visible hut that stuck like a cubical gall on the landward face of that humped desolate island. We all did that, stared at nothing in particular, and meditated enormously. But in what I felt at the time was a wild spirit of adventure, I went out one night to the point of Gunver Head and saw an actual light within that distant hut, a patch of golden lichen on the mother parasite. Some aspect of humanity I found in that light it was, that finally decided me. That and some quality of sympathy perhaps with the hermit, mad criminal or lovelorn, who had found sanctuary from the pestilent touch of the encroaching crowd. It was, in fact, a wildish night, and I stayed until the little yellow speck went out, and all I could see through the murk was an occasional canopy of curving spray when the elbow of the Trevose light touched a bare corner of that black gulland. The making of a decision was no difficult matter, but while I waited for the necessary calm that would permit the occasional boat to land provisions on the island 2 miles out from the mainland, I suffered qualms of doubt and nervousness, and I suffered them alone, for I had determined that no hint of my adventure should be given to any one of our party until the voyage had been made. They might think that I had gone fishing, an excuse which had all the air of probability given to it by the coming of the boatman to say that the tide and wind would serve that morning. I had warned and bribed him to give no clue to my friends of the goal of my proposed excursion. My nervousness suffered no decrease as we approached the rock and saw the authentic figure of its single inhabitant awaiting our arrival. I had some consolation in the thought that he would be in some way prepared by the sight of our surprisingly passengered boat, but my mind shuddered at the necessity for using some conventional form of address if I would make at once my introduction an excuse. The civilized opening was so hopelessly incapable of expressing my sympathy, presenting instead so unmistakably, it seemed to me, the single solution of common curiosity. I wondered that he had not, as the boatman so clearly assured me was the case, had other prying visitors before me. My self-consciousness increased as we came nearer to the single opening among the spiked rocks that served as a miniature harbour at half-tide. I felt that I was being watched by the man who now stood awaiting us at the water's edge, and suddenly my spirit broke. I decided that I could not force myself upon him, that I would remain in the boat while its cargo was delivered, and then return with the boatman to Trevone. So resolute was I in this plan that when we had pulled into the tiny landing place, I kept my gaze steadfastly averted from the man I had come to see, and stared solemnly out at the humped back of Trevose, seen now in an entirely new aspect. The sound of the hermit's voice startled me from a perfectly genuine abstraction. "Fairly decent weather today," he remarked with, I thought, a touch of nervousness. He had, I remembered, addressed the same remark to the boatmen, who were now conveying their cargo up to the hut. I looked up and met his stare. He was indeed regarding me with a curious effect of concentration, as if he were eager to note every detail of my expression. "Jolly," I replied. "Been pretty beastly the last day or two. Kept you rather short, hasn't it?" "I make allowances for that," he said. "Keep a reserve, you know. Are you staying over there?" He nodded towards the bay. "For a week or two," I told him, and we began to discuss the country around Harlyn with the eagerness of two strangers who find a common topic at a dull reception. "Never been on the Gullen before, I suppose?" he ventured at last when the boatmen had discharged their load and were evidently ready to be off. No, I haven't," I said, and hesitated. I felt that the invitation must come from him. He boggled over it by saying, "Dashed awkward place to get to and nothing to see, of course. I don't know if you're at all keen on fishing." "Rather," I said with enthusiasm. "There's deep water on the other side of the rock," he went on. "In the right weather you get splendid bass there." He stopped and then added, "It'll be absolutely top hole for 'em this afternoon." "Perhaps I could come back," I began, but the boatman interrupted me at once. "You can come back tomorrow, sure enough," he said. "Tide only serves once every 12 hours. "If you care to stay now," began the hermit. "Thanks, it's awfully good of you. I should like to of all things," I said. I stayed on the clear understanding that the boatmen were to fetch me the next morning. At first there was really very little that seemed in any way strange about the man on the Gulland. His name, he told me, was William Copley, but it appeared that he was no relation to the Copleys I knew, and if he had shaved he would have looked a very ordinary type of Englishman roughing it on a holiday. His age I judged to be between 30 and 40. Only two things about him struck me as a little queer during our very successful afternoon's fishing. The first was that intense appraising stare of his, as if he tried to fathom the very depths of one's being. The second was an inexplicable devotion to one particular form of ceremony. As our intimacy grew, he dropped the ordinary formal politeness of a host, but he insisted always on one observance that I supposed at first to be the merely conventional business of giving precedence. Nothing would induce him to go in front of me. He sent me ahead even as we explored the little purlieus of his rock. The only level square yard on the whole island was in the floor of the hut. But presently I noticed that this peculiarity went still further, and that he would not turn his back on me for a single moment. That discovery intrigued one. I still excluded the explanation of madness. Copley's manner and conversation were so convincingly sane. But I reverted to and elaborated those other two suggestions that had been made. I could not avoid the inference that the man must in some strange way be afraid of me, and I hesitated as to whether he were flying from some form of justice or from revenge, perhaps a vendetta. Either theory seemed to account for his intense appraising stare. I inferred that his longing for companionship had grown so strong that he had determined to risk the possibility of my being an emissary, sent by some, to me, exquisitely romantic person, or persons who desired Copley's death. I recalled and wallowed in some of the marvellous imaginings of the novelist. I wondered if I could make Copley speak by convincing him of my innocent identity. How I thrilled at the prospect, but the explanation of it all came without any effort on my part. He sent me out of the hut while he prepared our supper. Quite a magnificent meal, by the way. I saw his reason at once. He could not manage all that business of cooking and laying the table without turning his back on me. One thing, however, puzzled me a little. He drew down the blind of the little square window as soon as I had gone outside. Naturally, I made no demur. I climbed down to the edge of the sea. It was a glorious evening, and waited until he called me. He stood at the door of the hut until I was within a few feet of him, and then retreated into the room and sat down with his back to the wall. We discussed our afternoon sport as we had supper, but when we had finished and our pipes were going, he said suddenly, "I don't see why I shouldn't tell you." Like a fool, I agreed eagerly, when I might so easily have stopped him. "It began when I was quite a kid," he said. "My mother found me crying in the garden, and all I could tell her was that Claude, my elder brother, looked horrid. I couldn't bear the sight of him for days afterwards either. But I was such a perfectly normal child that they weren't seriously perturbed about this one idiosyncrasy of mine. They thought that Claude had made a face at me and frightened me. My father whacked me for it eventually. Perhaps that whacking stuck in my mind. Anyway, I didn't confide my peculiarity to anyone until I was nearly 17. I was ashamed of it, of course. I am still, in a way." He stopped and looked down, pushed his plate away from him, and folded his arms on the table. I was pining to ask a question, but I was afraid to interrupt. And after a moment's hesitation, he looked up and held my gaze again, but now without that inquiring look of his. Rather, he seemed to be looking for sympathy. "I told my housemaster," he said. "He was a splendid chap, and he was very decent about it. Took it all quite seriously, and advised me to consult an oculist, which I did. I went in the holidays with the pater. I had given him a more reasonable account of my trouble, and he took me to the best man in London. He was tremendously interested, and it proves that there must be something in it, that it can't be imagination, because he really found a defect in my eyes, something quite new to him, he said. He called it a new form of astigmatism, but of course, as he pointed out, no glasses would be any use to me." "But what?" I began, unable to keep down my curiosity any longer. Copley hesitated and dropped his eyes. "Astigmatism, you know," he said, "is a defect. I quote the dictionary. I learned that definition by heart. I often puzzle over it still. Causing images of lines having a certain direction to be indistinctly seen, while those of lines transverse to the former are distinctly seen. Only mine is peculiar in the fact that my sight is perfectly normal, except when I look back at anyone over my shoulder." He looked up almost pathetically. I could see that he hoped I might understand without further explanation. I had to confess myself utterly mystified. What had this trifling defect of vision to do with his coming to live on the Gulland, I wondered. I frowned my perplexity. "But I don't see," I said. He knocked out his pipe and began to scrape the bowl with his pocket-knife. "Well, mine is a kind of moral astigmatism too," he said. "At least it gives me a kind of moral insight. I'm afraid I must call it insight. I've proved in some cases that—" He dropped his voice. He was apparently deeply engrossed in the scraping out of his pipe. He kept his eyes on it as he continued. "Normally, you understand, when I look at people straight in the face, I see them as anybody else sees them. But when I look back at them over my shoulder, I see all their vices and defects. Their faces remain in a sense the same, perfectly recognizable, I mean, but distorted, beastly. There was my brother Claude, good-looking chap he was, but when I saw him that way, he had a nose like a parrot, and he looked sort of weakly voracious. And vicious. He stopped and shuddered slightly, and then added, "And one knows now that he is like that too. He's just been hammered on the stock exchange. Rotten sort of failure it was. And then Dennison, my housemaster, you know, such a decent chap. I never looked at him that way until the end of my last term at school. I had got into the habit, more or less, of never looking over my shoulder, you see, but I was always getting caught. That was an instance. I was playing for the school against the old boys. Dennison called out, 'Good luck, old chap,' just as I was going in, and I forgot and looked back at him. I waited breathless, and as he did not go on, I prompted him with, 'Was he wrong too?' Copley nodded. 'Weak, poor devil. His eyes were all right, but they were fighting his mouth, if you know what I mean. There would have been an awful scandal at the school there 4 years after I left, if they hadn't hushed it up and got Dennison out of the country. Then, if you want any more instances, there was the oculist. Big fine chap he was. Of course, he made me look at him over my shoulder to test me. He asked me what I saw, and I told more or less. He went simply livid for a moment. He was a sensualist, you see, and when I saw him that way, he looked like some filthy old hog. The thing that really finished me,' he went on after a long interval, "was the breaking off of my engagement to Helen. We were frightfully in love with one another, and I told her about my trouble. She was very sympathetic, and I suppose rather sentimentally romantic too. She believed it was some sort of spell that had been put on me. I think, anyway, she had a theory that if I once saw anybody truly and ordinarily over my shoulder, I should never have any more trouble. The spell would be broken, sort of thing. And of course, she wanted to be the person. I didn't resist her much. I was infatuated, I suppose. Anyway, I thought she was perfection, and that it was simply impossible that I could find any defect in her. So I agreed, and looked that way." His voice had fallen to an even note of despondency, as though the telling of this final tragedy in his life had brought him to the indifference of despair. "I looked," he continued, "and saw a creature with no chin and watery, doting eyes, a faithful, slobbery thing. Ugh! I can't. I never spoke to her again." "That broke me, you know," he said presently. "After that I didn't care. I used to look at everyone that way until I had to get away from humanity. I was living in a world of beasts. Most of them looked like some beast or bird or other. The strong were vicious and criminal, and the weak were loathsome. I couldn't stick it. In the end, I had to come here away from them all." A thought occurred to me. "Have you ever looked at yourself in the glass?" I asked. He nodded. "I'm no better than the rest of them," he said. "That's why I grew this rotten beard. I haven't got a looking glass here." "And you can't keep a stiff neck, as it were?" I asked, "going about looking humanity straight in the face?" "The temptation is too strong," Copley said. "And it gets stronger. Curiosity partly, I suppose, but partly it's the momentary sense of superiority it gives you. You see them like that, you know, and forget how you look yourself. And then after a bit, it sickens you." "You haven't," I said and hesitated. I wanted to know, and yet I was horribly afraid. "You haven't," I began again, you haven't, looked at me yet, that way?" "Not yet," he said. "Do you suppose—" "Probably. You look all right, of course, but then so did heaps of the others." "You've no idea how I should look to you that way." "Absolutely none. I've been trying to guess, but I can't." "You wouldn't care?" "Not now," he said sharply. "Perhaps just before you go." "You feel fairly certain, then?" He nodded with disgusting conviction. I went to bed wondering whether Helen's theory wasn't a true one, and if I might not break the spell for poor Copley. The boatman came for me soon after 11 the next morning. I had shaken off some of the feeling of superstitious horror that had held me overnight, and I had not repeated my request to Copley, nor had he offered to look into the dark places of my soul. He came down after me to the landing place, and we shook hands warmly, but he said nothing about my revisiting him. And then, just as we were putting off, he turned back towards the hut and looked at me over his shoulder, just one quick glance. "Wait!" I commanded the boatman, and I stood up and called to him. "I say, Copley!" I shouted. He turned and looked at me, and I saw that his face was transfigured. He wore an expression of foolish disgust and loathing. I had seen something like it on the face of an idiot child who was just going to be sick. I dropped down into the boat and turned my back on him. I wondered then if that was how he had seen himself in the glass. But since I have only wondered what it was he saw in me, and I can never go back to ask him. The end.